ordered to have his lines formed for the ceremony at sunrise on Wednesday morning, April 12, 1865. It was a gray, chilly day. The Union lines extended along both sides of the Richmond-Lynchburg Stage Road from the banks of the Appomattox River up and over the hill to a point near the McLean house. Some Union troops could see the Confederates across the river break camp and form ranks. They watched them march across the stream and up the hill toward the courthouse. General Chamberlain described the scene.
Instruction had been given, and when the head of each division column comes opposite our group, our bugle sounds the signal, and instantly our whole line, from right to left, regiment by regiment in succession, gives the soldier's salutation, from the order arms to the old carry, the marching salute. Gordon, at the head of the Confederate column, riding with heavy spirit and downcast face, catches the sound of shifting arms, looks up, and taking the meaning, wheels superb, making with himself and his horse one uplifted figure, with profound salutation, as he drops the point of his sword to the boot toe. Then, facing to his own command, gives word for his successive brigades to pass us with the same position of the manual. Honor answering honor. On our part, not a sound of trumpet, nor roll of drum, not a cheer, nor word, nor whisper of vain glory, nor motion of men standing again at the order, but of all stillness from and breath hold, as if it were the passing of death.
Thus, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia surrendered. From the events of that day, a new and greater America emerged.
Mason-Dixon line cut a burning, bloody swath right through the heart of Pennsylvania, my home state, until they were finally stopped in their tracks by Meade's boys, a place called Gettysburg. Now, Gettysburg, you have to understand, is only a few miles away from my hometown of Nestebec, and we knew that it only takes one Confederate raiding squadron to come by and leave our homes in flames and our lives in ruin. We lived in fear of that while they fought and died at Gettysburg. And so we stayed awake, watched all hours of the night, guarded the windows and the doors, prayed that we would never hear those telltale hoofbeats on the horizon. Fortunately, folks, we never did. Because fortunately, as we all know, Meade managed to hold them back at Gettysburg, to send old Bobby Lee back on the run to Virginia with his tail between his legs, and the lucky thing for us, it was not a victory that came without a cost. Indeed, Meade's boys were severely depleted by their victory at Meade's boys were severely depleted by their victory at Gettysburg. They knew if they were going to keep chasing old Bobby Lee back down into Virginia, they'd need more men to do it. So when the order came down for my county to assist in forming an emergency militia regiment, a cavalry unit to serve for 6 months and to help chase Bobby Lee, well, I figured my chance had finally come. I told my father as such. I said, this time, one of us has to go. One of us has to go, and there's nothing that you can say or do to stop me. Well, as it turns out, I was wrong about that too, folks, because when I got up that next morning, fully prepared to saddle up a horse and ride out and join the cavalry, well, I found him gone in my place. My own father had left with nothing but a note that night, gone and taken my place in the cavalry. Taken it because he knew that it would do nothing but trap me, force me to remain in my position, to stay where I was, and to tend my family while he was gone. He intended to keep me out of the war. He left nothing but a note to explain his actions. Now, I didn't read that note for quite a long while, folks. At first, I was too upset. But finally, I worked up the nerve and I read it. He told me. He said, well, son, I know you will be displeased with the action I have taken. But you have a life ahead of you. You will grow up and marry and start a family of your own, maybe even own land of your own one day. You have that ahead of you, and I have already lived the life that I want to live. I have done the things that I want to do, and if I allow you to put your future at risk while I sit here and do nothing, then I cannot call myself a man in your presence." So he left me alone to deal with the burden of feeding and providing for my family while he went off and fought in the army. Fought for my sake. It was not easy, folks. Not easy while he was gone. I did a lot of thinking that winter while he campaigned, and I was angry at him, folks. Make no mistake about that. Angrier than I have ever been in my life. But beyond that, folks, I was ashamed. Ashamed that I had let someone else take my place in that battle line again. That was what I could not bear, that he was out there putting his life on the line for my sake, while I could do nothing but sit at home, impotent, while he able to do nothing to help. That was what galled me most of all. And I reached a resolution about that winter. This time, I said, this time I would not take no for an answer ever again. This time, the only person doing my fighting would be me. So I resolved myself to begin pushing for that just as soon as he arrived home. And sure enough, when he came back over that hill and in through our door, I resolved immediately. I began pushing just as soon as he walked in. And I'll tell you, folks, we fought like cats and dogs over it that year. All through last year, we fought and argued until finally, around harvest time, around September, I finally got through to him. And I remember it very clearly. I took him aside one day and I told him, I said, "Father, if I do not do my part for this army, for this conflict, then I cannot think myself worthy of the future that you want for me. I cannot think myself worthy to enjoy all those benefits that you wish for me if I do not do my duty here and now." That was what I told him. And finally, took him back. He didn't say anything for quite a long while until finally he looked up. He said, "Well, that's the way it is, son, then I reckon as much as I'd like to, I can't stop you." And I knew that was permission that I'd been seeking for so long, and I did not waste it. The very next day, indeed, I got up on a horse. I rode all the way down to Philadelphia, where I enlisted with the 199th. Next thing I knew, I was on a steamship bound for Virginia. Now, we landed, folks, in Virginia at a place called Petersburg, where, as many of you will recall, a great siege was going on last year. Our boys were attacking Bobby Lee within the walls, trying to drive him from the city, lay open Petersburg and the Confederate capital of Richmond to our capture. And I, not knowing much of military matters, believed that as soon as we landed, we would be thrown into combat, handed muskets, told to fight and die for Old Glory, just like the story said. As anyone who's been in the Army will tell you, that Army life is a little bit more complicated than shooting at people. And we landed at Petersburg, all right, landed and formed up in our ranks. But that first day, we were not given muskets. We were given shovels. We were told to get to work. See, what I didn't realize is that we landed in October. And October is winter quarters for the Army. After all, after that, it gets too cold to campaign, too cold to feed and move your armies. And so the Army was going to stay where it was. Its lines remained static. And that gave them ample time to train us up, to make us into better soldiers and better men. And to put a long story short, they set about that task assiduously. Now, those first few months were not spent fighting, but instead digging and drilling and picketing. And digging and drilling, they're exhausting enough. Picketing's worse. Now, of course, they're exhausting because they're hard work. Digging the trenches that protect your lines, drilling to make you submit to discipline, to follow orders. Those are all important, and they're so exhausting that sometimes you'll fall so fast asleep that the only way to wake you up is to kick you in the ribs. Had bruises all over mine for weeks. That's not the worst of all, folks. The worst is picket duty. Because picket duty is simply patrolling those trenches that you've so recently dug, guarding against rebel incursions, making sure they don't do anything funny. Of course, what they don't tell you is that they're shelling your lines the entire time. Sometimes their own lines get so close to yours that you can hear those boys just out of sight. And I'll tell you, it is not the most dangerous duty in the Army, picketing. But make no mistake, it is no less easy to bear because of that. Because when you stand on those battle lines and you see those shells arc up towards you, you hear those boys chattering in those trenches, and even if they do nothing, even if those shells don't hit anybody, and those Confederates don't mount any raids that day, you can't help but think, well, maybe I'm lucky today, but maybe tomorrow I'll be on the wrong end of a Confederate shell or a bayonet. You can't help but think that when you stand on those battle lines, and it grabs a hold of you, that knowledge, and stays on. Sometimes you don't always realize it's there. Sometimes it is like a ghost, but it stays with you as long as you're out there. It is a subtle kind of fear, folks, but make no mistake, it is no less terrible because it is subtle. And so we passed away those first few months just like that, digging and drilling and picking. After that winter passed, I was ready for just about anything to break that monotony of fear and exhaustion. Well, when April finally came, and with it spring, I finally got my chance. Because then, you see, General Sheridan and his boys captured a little place called Five Forks, Virginia. And Five Forks, as it turned out, was the key to everything. Now, Five Forks itself isn't much to look at, folks. Just a little road junction in the middle of nowhere, a little ways south and west of Petersburg. The key to Five Forks is not what's there, but what lies beyond it. Because beyond Five Forks runs the South Side Railroad. And down the South Side Railroad was coming all of Lee's supplies. All of his food, his weapons, his ammunition, his uniforms, his men. Everything was coming down the South Side Railroad this time in the siege. And Lee knew that if that railroad was cut, then he would no longer be able to defend Petersburg. Thank God, that's exactly what happened on that first day of April. Our boys broke through at Five Forks. They got to that railroad and they took possession of it, cut it for the Union. That meant that for the first time, the cards were finally in our hands. We didn't intend to put them down without striking a victory. And so we set about it. The very next day, all of our regiments were ordered to the front, and we were told to begin a general assault on the works of Petersburg, to drive Lee from the walls and to send him on the run once and for all. That was what we set about doing. Now, my regiment, we were tasked with assaulting a place called Fort Gregg, Virginia. Now, Fort Gregg itself isn't much to look at either, folks. Just a little earthworks in the middle of a wide open field. That's deceptive, you see. That terrain defends Fort Gregg just as well as the rebels on top of its walls. That wide open field, that means no cover on any side. Nothing to protect you from rebel bullets. And worse yet, it rained all that week, turned that field into a pit of mud. So thick in some places you could sink up to your ankles in it. And that, folks, that makes for a trying assault. Perhaps it is ungallant of me to admit, but when we broke that tree line and we saw that fort standing stark in front of us, well, maybe it is ungallant of me to admit, folks, but I have never been so terrified in all of my life as I was in that moment. And that kind of fear is not subtle. When that kind of fear grabs hold of you, it squeezes until either it breaks or you do. When you stand on a battle line and feel that kind of fear, you want nothing more than to crawl into a hole and stay there for the rest of your life. I was no exception. To this day, folks, why I didn't do that, I don't suppose I'll ever know. Some, I suppose, would call it patriotism or courage or divine providence. Truth be told, I don't know myself. But all I do know is for whatever word it should be called, whatever purpose, when they sounded that charge, despite that fear, I charged. And a whole lot of other boys who were just as terrified as I was charged with me. And that, I believe, whatever you call it, is something to be awfully proud of. And so we charged. And now I will not burden you folks with the details of that assault. Suffice to say that it was, so they tell us, one of the most bloody battles of the entire war. Many of our boys were cut down in that assault, trying to drive Lee's boys from the walls, and many of them did not make it over the top. And and I will not burden you with the details of my memories of that assault. Believe me, they are burden enough to me. I will tell you this. To me, I have never lost the memory of that battle, nor do I believe I ever will. To me, every moment of that battle stands out just as sharp as if it is still happening. It's clear-cut and sharp-edged as it was in that moment. And so it seems as if it lasted an eternity. When it felt as if I had lived another lifetime between that morning and when we watched the rebels finally retreat from those walls. And when we saw that, I was overcome by an exhaustion so profound that I wanted nothing more in that moment than to become Rip Van Winkle, to sit down and sleep for 30 years on end. But of course, as much as I would have wished that, as much as I may have deserved it or not, it was not to be, because of course the job was not done, and the Army had other plans for me. Because of course, you see, Lee retreated from the walls of Petersburg, but he retreated in good order, 60,000 men still at his command. And he knew that he still had a plan at victory. If he could outdistance us Union boys and march south down into North Carolina, then he could link up there with a fellow named Joe Johnston, who was still fighting, to keep the fight going for Lord knows how long with their combined armies. Now our job was to make sure that that was never to happen. And so just as soon as we won that victory, as soon as we drove him from the walls, we set to following Bobby Lee, chasing him, making sure that that end could never be reached. Now, the majority of our armies, as part of our strategy, were set to following him from behind, tailing him, hounding at his heels, to make sure that he could never stop, could never rest, could never take a breather. That was what that army was tasked with. The job of my army, the army at the James, our job was a little different. Because our job was not to follow from behind, but instead to follow from alongside, to parallel Lee's lines, so that if ever he decided to turn south, we'd be right there to stop him. And so, that was what we set out doing on a merry chase that week all through Virginia. We did not know who would prevail, but we were given an unexpected boon by what happened at Amelia Courthouse. Now, as Lee retreated, he hoped to resupply at Amelia Courthouse, to resupply there, to feed his men for the next 2 weeks, and then return south right there, fully supplied. When he arrived in Amelia Courthouse, he found everything that he needed. Everything that he needed to resupply, except for one crucial thing: time. See, to resupply, you need a couple hours. You need some time to give that supply out to your men, to load it on wagons, and to send it rolling behind you. Lee didn't have that. When he arrived in Amelia Courthouse, he found all those supplies waiting in the warehouse. He also found us with only 2 hours behind him. So he knew that if he stopped to pick up those supplies, gave himself that crucial delay, then he would be surrounded, encircled by our army. Those supplies would be of no use to him or anyone else. And so, although it galled him, he was forced to keep marching, to leave those supplies moldering in that depot while he and his army marched further and further west. And that put him in a dire situation, because without those supplies, his army was hard up. They were severely strained. And he knew that if he didn't find supplies and find them fast, then his army was going to disintegrate around him. He'd be riding to meet Joe Johnston alone. And so he was forced to keep marching, try and march day and night, wear out his men trying to put that crucial distance between him and us, so that when he found supplies, he would be able to take advantage of them. And so he kept marching further and further and further west, always just one step ahead of us, and only barely, hemorrhaging men all the while, till finally, when he got here to Appomattox County, he figured he had finally found his chance. Because that day he had heard word that he had outdistanced us finally. The army of the James, my army, was tasked with, we had fallen behind. We were still 35 miles behind Lee back at Farmville when he arrived here on April 8th. And better yet, he had heard word that up the road a few miles, up at Appomattox Station, there was a supply train coming. Everything that he needed to feed his army in the days to come. So he knew that this was his chance. If he could get to that food supply, give it out, and hook south before the army of the James arrived to put pressure on him, then he could get away with the thing after all. So that was the plan that he set into motion. He sent his cannons forward as a vanguard, well ahead of the main army, and they came rumbling up through this village here, right down this road, right in front of you, all the way up to Appomattox Station, where they found that food supply laying in the train. They took possession of it, the Confederates, at least for a little while. You see, we knew about that food supply too. We knew about it, and we knew exactly how important it was to Lee, and that meant we had no intention of letting him hang on to it for too long. And so, although our main infantry column wasn't able to catch up with him in time, there was one force that could. The cavalry, under a fellow named George Armstrong Custer. Kind of a rising star in our army. I believe he'll go far, but he does have a bit of a problem with impetuousness. Hopefully he'll outgrow that with time, though. But at any rate, well, Custer and his boys rode pell-mell for Appomattox Station right behind those cannons, all the way around Lee's force until they got there. They found the cannoneers entirely unprepared for their arrival, struck them, and drove them right back off again. Took possession of the food supply, burned it, so that Lee's men could never get back to it. And that put Lee in a dire situation, because not only has he lost that food supply, now he's got a Union force blocking the western road, blocking his only route of escape. And so he knows that his only hope is to break through that force in the morning, to break through them, to reopen that road, and to keep marching further west in hope of finding more supplies. So that's what he decides to do. And on the morning of April 9th, he sets it into motion. He sends his infantry marching through this village here, all the way, and they line up right along the outside edge of that fence, facing that field. On top of that hill, way out there, was our cavalry boys under a fellow named General Crook, who relieved Custer in the middle of the night. They were sitting up there guarding the road, waiting for Lee's boys. They didn't have to wait long. Just as soon as those boys formed up in that field, they gave up the old rebel yell. They charged up that hill, slammed into our cavalry, and swept them from the top of that hill. Wasn't even close. What they didn't know, well, I believe what they did know was that they had swept off that cavalry force, and they believed that was the only force standing in their way. After all, what could have gotten there in time? What force could be standing in their way? And so when they came over the top of that hill, I have no doubt they believed that the game was over. That's not what they found when they came over the top of that hill. Instead, folks, they found us, the army of the James, 15,000 men strong in full battle array, waiting to tell them good morning. Now, what they see, of course, you might be wondering, folks, now how did you get there in time? You folks were still, 35 miles away back in Farmville the previous day? Well, I wish I had a good answer for you folks. The simplest one is the best. We walked. We walked 35 miles in 20 hours, all through that night and well into the next morning, too. And I'll tell you, we were all exhausted by that march to catch up with old Bobby Lee. We did not complain. We knew how important our task was. If we could get in front of him and cut him off, then we could finally put an end to all this bleeding and fighting and dying. That was on our shoulders that evening, and we did not shirk. We did not complain, and so we marched all the way that day, all the way up to Appomattox Station where we rendezvoused, and we were marching all the way down to form up when Lee's men came over the top of that hill. We were right there waiting for them. So we gave them a mighty what for. We pushed them right back over the top of this hill and all the way down back into this village here, when finally Lee realized the game was over. After all, now he's got a great force to his west, a great force to his east, a great force to his south, the swollen river that he can't cross to the north. And that leaves him two options. Either stay here, make a stand, and fight to the death, or surrender. Fortunately, folks, he chose the latter. We didn't know that at the time. We didn't know that as we were fighting out there in that field, and out comes the rider bearing the white flag. We saw a ceasefire flag, and we didn't think much of it, to tell you the truth. We held our fire all right. We knew that mostly truce flags never amount to anything. Generals squabble about one thing or the other, talks break down, and then you go right back to shooting each other. We assumed this one would be no different. But we knew soon enough, eventually, we were proven wrong. We knew by what came up this road that this time was going to be different. Because a few minutes later, we see a rider come up this road on a fine white horse with a beautiful gray uniform and a fine beard, just as prim a peacock as you've ever seen sit a horse. And we knew that could only be one man, old Bobby Lee himself, commander of the Confederate Army, come talk. If he was on the front lines, then something big was sure to happen. Sure enough, he comes riding up this road here, past the courthouse, down the lane to Mr. McLean's house, a big brick house on the left. When he turns in, gets off his horse, ties it up, and goes on inside. And then, to top it all, a few minutes later, we hear a thunder from behind our own lines. Down comes this great body of federal officers, and riding at their head is this fellow with mud all the way up his sides, and brown beard and sort of a stocky figure. We knew that could only be one man as well. Ulysses S. Grant, our commanding officer, commanding general of all of our armies. And if he and General Lee were down here on the front lines, then it must mean something incredible is about to happen. He came riding down from that road all the way down into town to Mr. McLean's house, where he turned right in, settled in, and walked on in. And then, folks, there was nothing to do but wait. So we waited and waited and waited until finally those doors open. Out come the two generals. Grant shakes hands with Lee. Lee gets up on his horse and rides back all the way down to his camp. And soon enough, a rider comes bursting out of that yard, riding down with the message that he was bearing to the officers and the high commanders. And as he passed us by, waiting for him outside in that field, he took off his cap just like this and waved it around in victory. And then, folks, then we knew that it was over. And a mightier cheer has never gone up from a Union Army than went up in that day. Boys laughed and danced. A band struck up auld lang syne. Some sang and embraced each other, and I just sat down and wept right there on the spot. I reckon many of you folks would do quite the same in my position. It was not long for us to celebrate. Indeed, it was only a few minutes later that we received a strict order from High Command that all celebration was to cease immediately. And a lot of boys were angry about that. After all, we had just won this great conflict. Did we not deserve a little celebration? Did we not deserve to celebrate our victory? But there was a good reason for that order. There was a good reason for it, and indeed it didn't come from High Command, not originally. Instead, it came from a much higher authority, someone higher than even Grant. Does anybody have any guesses?
President.
The President. President Lincoln himself gave that order because, you see, President Lincoln was a little bit wiser than us privates, and he knew that he didn't just want to win a civil war. What he wanted was to reunite a nation, and that's a little bit more difficult. And so Lincoln knew that if he wanted to win a civil war, then he'd done it. All you have to do to win a civil war is to get your enemy on the ground and to keep hitting him and hitting him and hitting him until he can't get back up again. That's how you win a civil war. And Lincoln had done that already. But he knew that if he did that with the South, if he crushed them into the dirt, then as soon as they got their feet back under them again, they'd be right back up and swinging. They would rise against us again. It would be like no peace ever existed. Lincoln didn't want that. He wanted permanent peace, permanent unity. And he knew a way to reunite a country well and truly, is not to beat your enemy into the ground. Instead, it is to lift him back up, to embrace him as a brother and a friend, to treat him with kindness, to forgive him. That's how you reunite a nation. And Lincoln knew it, and he set it into practice right here at Appomattox. And so that order came down. We were not to disrespect these folks because they were United States citizens again. We were not to celebrate because it would disrespect them. We were to treat them not as conquered enemies, but as humble fellow citizens. That was it. It's just as simple as that. And it was in that spirit of kindness and forgiveness that this gathering proceeded. It's in that spirit we were held at shoulder arms while those boys marched past to surrender their own. It was in that spirit that we printed 30,000 parole passes right here in this very tavern. 30,000 of them with free tickets home to every single rebel boy as long as he promised never to take up arms against us. It was in that very same spirit that my regiment, the 199th, was dispatched all the way up to Appomattox Station to load food on wagons and send them all the way down to the Confederate camps. The very same people, mind you, which we had fought so hard to deprive of food only a few days before. So we fed those boys, we clothed them, we watched them walk away. It was all by the guiding spirit of Abraham Lincoln. We were not to have that guiding spirit for very long, folks, as you well know. Indeed, it was only a few days later that we heard that he had been killed, cut down in cold blood by a coward and a fool. Make no mistake, John Wilkes Booth is nothing but. And now we mourned him, folks. Mourned him down here right alongside many of these Southern folks. But more than that, folks, what we were was scared. Scared that we would be ordered to take revenge, to avenge his death on Southern blood and Southern bodies, and that was not something that we could oblige. We had had enough of war, enough of fighting and violence. So had these Southerners. We did not want to return to it. So I thank God every day that that order never came down, and I always will. With that, folks, well, we did lose something that day. We lost him, the great emancipator, the only one able to command the respect of both North and South. Only one with a plan on how to reunite this broken nation. That was what we lost when we lost Lincoln. We lost the plan. Without him, I don't know if we'll ever find it again. I hope that we will, but I have seen no signs that anyone has an idea on how to reunite this broken country. And whether we will find that again or not, I don't know. I suppose that depends on everyone, even you folks. But we certainly don't have one now. I hope that we will find one again, but I have seen no signs of it. For all that, folks, for all that confusion that Lincoln's death put us in, life in the Army went on mostly as it always has. Indeed, it was only a few days after those boys finished trickling out of here that we left ourselves, marched all the way back 100 miles to Richmond, where I intended to run out the rest of my enlistment, serving those people and helping them rebuild. Of course, I was wrong about what the Army had planned for me as well. You might have noticed that's a theme here. But indeed, I did not spend the rest of my enlistment waiting in Richmond. Instead, only a few weeks later, I was transferred to a whole new regiment, the 188th, and I was told to start marching again. And wouldn't you believe where I marched? 100 miles, all the way back here to Appomattox County, the very same place which I had just marched 100 miles to get away from. Now, how's that for military efficiency? Of course, it wasn't without good cause, folks. War may be over here, but that doesn't mean things are settling. Indeed, Appomattox still has many problems. There is no law and order here after the sheriff was arrested for horse thievery and murder a few weeks ago. There is no central government, no money to buy or sell things because everybody lost their fortunes by putting them in Confederate dollars. There is no money, no economy, and bad crops this year as no one was home to harvest them. And, of course, all the problems that apply to other Appomattox citizens apply to the freedmen just as 10 times as much. They may be free, and that is a glorious thing, but it doesn't mean that much when you have no money, no possessions, no prospects, no job, no education, nothing with which to sustain yourself. Your freedom is worth just as much as the paper it's worth. These folks don't have those things yet. They are forced by the lack thereof, although they would rather have anything but, to remain on the plantations where they have always lived and worked, to serve the same people, to do the same jobs because there is simply nowhere else for them to go and nothing else for them to do. And we're trying to remedy that situation, folks, but it is not easy and it is not popular. There are 30 men of us, of Company D of the 188th here in Appomattox County. We are the only Union force in this area, and half of us are illiterates, told to do the job of kings and emperors. And I'll tell you, it's not easy work. But in spite of that, folks, in spite of all the difficulties that we've had in enforcing our will here, I do believe that it is good work that we're doing here. I believe that if we can do a little bit of the kindness and charity and forgiveness that Abraham Lincoln offered here in April, if we can offer that to these folks in their turn, then I will consider my job in the Army well done. I sincerely hope that if that is the case, and I can return to my father when my enlistment period expires in October and tell him that my time in the Army was well spent. And I hope that that is the case. But with that, folks, I'm sure you don't want to hear me blabber on any longer.
At some point,
It did. The Obama started writing a letter, Dear General Lee, I propose to receive the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia in the following terms, to wit, and I was going to